Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
And welcome to our event tonight, Race, Immigration, and the American Dream in the 21st Century, with our three very distinguished guest panelists, Christina Greer, Jason D. Hill, and Leah Rigueur. We feel privileged, especially this evening, to host this panel discussion in recognition of the achievements of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on this holiday commemorating his life and work. My name is Edmund Santuri. I'm Professor of Religion and Philosophy at St. Olaf College and Morrison Family Director of the college's Institute for Freedom and Community, the institute sponsoring our event tonight. The purpose of St. Olaf's Institute for Freedom and Community is to stimulate and sustain free inquiry and meaningful debate of important political and social issues among students, faculty, staff, and the larger public. By exploring diverse ideas about politics, markets, and society, the Institute aims to challenge presuppositions, question easy or comfortable answers, and foster constructive, civil dialogue among those with differing values and contending points of view. This very panel tonight, as I expect you'll see, evidences the Institute's commitment to viewpoint diversity. Since our guests represent, I think it's fair to say, very different disciplinary and normative perspectives on our topic. For help in organizing our events, special thanks go to the staff of the Institute, particularly to Administrative Assistant Shannon Rigueur and Assistant Director Greg Seams. Without their intelligent and vibrant energies, none of what you see tonight happens, and I'm deeply grateful to them for all they do. Thanks also to Molly Work and Carrie Vanderveen of Marketing and Communications, and to Jeff O'Donnell and his Broadcast Media Services crew for their contributions. Thanks finally to St. Olaf students, Nick Gonerman and Christoph Hodel, for their general support of the Institute and their special help tonight. As I've suggested already, our panelists are a very distinguished group. There isn't time tonight to recount all of their ample accomplishments, but to introduce them briefly, moving from the audience's left to right. We have with us first Christina Greer, an assistant professor of political science at
Associate.
Oops, sorry about that.
For the tenured people in the room, you know there's a difference.
Yeah, okay, that's important. Associate professor of political science at Fordham University, Lincoln Center, Manhattan campus. Her research and teaching focus are on American politics, Black ethnic politics, urban politics, quantitative methods, Congress, New York City and state politics, campaigns and elections, and public opinion. Her book, entitled Black Ethnics, Race, Immigration, and the Pursuit of the American Dream, explores the political significance of ethnicity for native-born blacks in the United States and new black immigrants to the United States from Africa and the Caribbean. Our next guest, Jason D. Hill, is professor of philosophy, honors distinguished faculty, and director of teaching practicum at DePaul University. His specializations are ethics, social and political philosophy, philosophy of education, and race theory. He is the author of 4 books, including most recently one titled We Have Overcome, An Immigrant's Letter to the American People, a book in which he recounts his life in this country as an immigrant from Jamaica and articulates a cosmopolitan philosophy of America that underscores what he calls the metaphysical irrelevance of race. Our third guest, Leah Rigueur, is an assistant professor of public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. She is an historian by training. She teaches courses on race, riot, and backlash in the United States, the civil rights movement, and race and policy in modern America. In her book, entitled The Loneliness of the Black Republican, Pragmatic Politics and the Pursuit of Power, she examines the histories of Black Republican activists, officials, and politicians from the era of the New Deal to Reagan's presidency in 1980. There is so much more I could say about our distinguished guests. They have all been, for example, commentators for a wide range of national media outlets. Those and other accomplishments are described in the program made available to you. We are so pleased and honored by their being with us tonight. Could you join me in welcoming Christina Greer, Jason Hill, and Leah Rigueur. The title of our event tonight, Race, Immigration, and the American Dream in the 21st Century, particularly on this day honoring Dr. King, generates undoubtedly a host of compelling and competing associations. Here are 4 quotations that capture some of the associations in my mind. The first quotation from the I Have a Dream speech of Dr. King himself. This will be familiar to most, but to remind, and I quote, "So I say to you, my friends, that even though we must face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream, that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." End of quotation. The second quotation is from Dr. King's lively contemporary, Malcolm X, and I quote, "So I'm not standing here speaking to you as an American, or a patriot, or a flag saluter, or a flag waver. No, not I. I'm speaking as a victim of this American system, and I see America through the eyes of the victim. I don't see any American dream. I see an American nightmare." End of quotation. The third quotation is from a book hot off the press, a wonderful book by Rigueur Allen entitled, "It Was All a Dream. A New Generation Confronts the Broken Promise to Black America." The words I quote are from the book are actually those of a 33-year-old black immigrant to the United States from Nigeria. And I quote, "I still believe that the new American dream is still sort of what it's been or portrayed to be. You're supposed to have a comfortable life, not a getting by life. They used to depict it with the house, 2 kids, the car in the garage, the picket fence. That's still the American dream. It's comfortability. It's not a hand-to-mouth existence. I do not have it. I'm still working on it. I'm still pursuing, still chasing the dream, whatever. Shout out to Martin Luther King." End of quotation. The final quotation is from a woman named Lena Lanzeri Salino de Curcio. I'm pretty sure you haven't heard of her. I beg your indulgence. She was my grandmother, an immigrant from Italy who came to this country as a child and settled in Providence, Rhode Island in the early part of the 20th century. Never had much, had something of a rough life, experienced a good bit of discrimination and insult as Italians were wont to experience at one time in this country's history. Lost her son to tuberculosis at the age of 19. Lost her husband at a young age while my mother was still a teenager. Worked her fingers to the bone as a seamstress to keep things going and improbably scraped enough savings together to buy my mother and her young family a house to live in, the house I lived in as a child. In summer 1970, I had just returned home from college and the US invasion of Cambodia. I was being critical of US involvement in Southeast Asia, Cambodia, Vietnam, and I was going on and on about it. My grandmother Lena listened patiently and lovingly and said finally in response, and I quote, "America's the greatest country in the world and don't you forget it." End of quote. These are just some of the associations generated in me as I reflect on the title of our event tonight. You in the audience will have your own distinctive associations and reflections, and our panelists certainly have theirs. We turn now to our panelists, who will each give some introductory remarks to lead us into more general conversation, and we begin with Professor Greer.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for having me. That last quote that you told us would be a surprise, I'm really glad you shared. I'm on the board of the Tenement Museum in New York City, and I implore all of you who ever visit New York to come and see it. We actually have an online program called Your Story, Our Story, where you can upload an object that represents your family's immigration story, or for some of us who are descendants of U.S. chattel slavery, your migration story, if you don't have an immigration story. So hopefully you all can look that up. So race, immigration, and the American dream. I mean, the larger question that I oftentimes think about is, can black people ever be seen as full citizens in this nation? And will they ever be able to acquire what is expected of this American dream. Oftentimes when we talk about it, it's a very sort of Norman Rockwell-esque. Do you guys know who Norman Rockwell is? Okay, one of my favorite artists. But when we talk about things like the greatest generation, maybe they are. I sort of get offended when Tom Brokaw always talks about it. But, you know, for so many people, sure, it's a very Norman Rockwell scene. But we always have to remember that during those beautiful picturesque paintings, there's another reality of the Americas that is happening, right? That we oftentimes don't talk about. And so in this nation, we really are invested in this myth that equality has always been something. Obviously, in modern conversations in politics, with the current president, you hear people using superlatives saying, like, this isn't who we are. We've never been a nation like this. We absolutely have been a nation like this. We are a nation that has been founded on patriarchy, white supremacy, anti-black racism, and capitalism. And so if we're not honest about our origin story, I don't understand how we can be honest about pursuing a dream for many immigrants that come. And so the work that I've done in my book, Black Ethnics, is really investigating with Caribbeans and Africans whether or not they can ever become full Americans. Because like so many other immigrants who are able to become American, Black immigrants are American with a prefix. So they're Black American. And this is the first time that, you know, scholars have ever seen immigrants wishing to remain immigrant. In the past, as you all know, many immigrants from Italy or Germany or Ireland quickly wanted to assimilate. But this was one of the first times we were seeing people not want to assimilate so quickly, because if they did, they'd be identified as Black Americans. So by maintaining an immigrant identity, it separated them from being what they perceived was last place, if we're looking at sort of racial hierarchy in a totem pole. So that's why I wrote it. There's this idea also, though, that I came up with, which is this concept of elevated minority, in the sense that, if you all heard of the term model minority, right, often ascribed to Asian Americans in the United States. And so when I surveyed and interviewed several respondents for my book, I found that they would never be considered sort of Asian Americans in that status, but they were still considered elevated, not just by white Americans, but by other Black Americans themselves, which we still need to delve into. My book, in many ways, is an opening conversation, not an ending conversation. And so for so long, this nation has been a nation of whites versus non-whites, or whites keeping other people out of this protected category. And I think this is the real tension that we're seeing right now, because this country can't make any more white people, right? So over time, slowly but surely, the nation has allowed Irish to become white, and Italians to become white, and Germans, and Jewish folks, and lots of other people. But we're at a moment now where there are no more people to make white. And so the numbers game ends where it is. And so this is the tension that our president talks about, and that many people are very worried about. I'm not worried about it, but I'm a global majority. I'm a woman and I'm a person of color. So globally, most people are women or people of color, so I'm fine. But in the United States, there's a real concern about white identity and whiteness and what that means as a majority status. And so obviously in the Q&A, I'm more than welcome to get into that and delve into it, but I really think that we're at this moment where we're forced to reckon with a large part of our history that has excluded people of color for so long and limited real prospects of the American dream. We've just never had it so vocally expressed in, say, the latter 20th, early 21st century. And so, as many people worry about the rollback of something like the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and the Immigration Act, those three acts I see passed, you know, in conjunction with LBJ's administration, I see them as a triumvirate of acts that should not be separated, because if you roll back one, you roll back all. And so conversations around immigration are obviously conversations around civil rights, and they're obviously conversations that have real effects for voting and representation. And so I'll pause there so we can hopefully get into more of a conversation in a few minutes.
Thank you. Jason?
Well, thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure to be here. There's a preamble to the Constitution, and I want to give a little preamble to what I have to say. That I think we live in an age of Americophobia, where this nation is under increasing attack as the worst country on earth, an intrinsically and constitutively racist and imperialist country in which people who have been previously excluded from the pantheon of the human community or the domain of the ethical stand no chance at all of being included there. I speak as a conservative Democrat, and I want to say that I do consider this country to be the most unapologetically exceptional country on the face of the earth. That I consider American civilization, not American culture, but American civilization, to be an unprecedented phenomenon in my reading of human civilizations. That the American dream, I'm a philosopher by training, and I think when philosophers talk with people, quite often we twist ourselves into these semantic pretzels because we don't define our concepts. So I want to say a little bit about why I think, what constitutes the American dream, why I think it is still the best place for immigrants, America, the best place for immigrants, black immigrants, all immigrants, to be in, and why I think, speaking as a mixed race but a black person, a self-identified black person, this is the best country and the only country that I would want to aspire to live in on the face of the earth. So when I think of the American dream, I don't think in terms of grandiosity. I don't think in terms of achieving superlative achievements. I think there's no one-size-fits-all conception of the American dream at all. I think that the American dream is, and I wrote it down because I wanted to be quite precise, the capacity to alter your past in some way, the capacity to modify your existence, the capacity to exercise self-transcendence and self-surpassing, to go beyond the brute fact of your identity that you were born with, to transcend them and to form a life plan based on your newly fashioned self. And so the immigrant who comes here illiterate, barely able to speak the language, who manages to carve out some conception of autonomy for herself or himself, who manages for the first time in his life or her life to alter a seemingly ineradicable and unalterable part of her identity. I'm speaking in terms here of a Dalit from India, an untouchable, who would never have been able to achieve upward mobility in India, and who comes to America, and no one in the South, where I lived for 8 years when I first came to this country, knew who a Dalit was. And this person is able to go through medical school, work his way through life, and become a doctor in Nebraska. I speak in terms of hundreds of immigrants that I have met in the 33 years that I have lived in this country, who have been able to, through sheer grit, tenacity, resilience, and honor, to refashion an identity, to start what I call metaphysically clean from scratch, to be given a chance by this great nation of ours, this unprecedented phenomenon in human history, to begin a life that they can claim as autonomously theirs. That part of the American dream is part of the moral meaning of America. This is an unprecedented phenomenon we live in, folks. That is a country in which citizenship is not based on blood, on lineage, on nationality, on religion or religious orientation. Until quite recently, Germany, a country I spent a couple of years living in, one could not achieve citizenship in that country unless one could demonstrate lineage and blood and ancestry. And we have in our midst a phenomenon in which, for the first time, the individual was born. For the first time, the first non-tribal country existed on the face of the earth, where we said, theoretically and empirically at least, anyone is free to come here. And there have been exceptions, of course, and it has been a messy, nefarious history. But anyone theoretically is free to come here and become a part of this great nation, regardless of background and origin. So I think the American dream, when conceived in that way, as not something depicting a white picket fence and achieving enormous financial success, but the simple opportunity to modify your existence, to transcend the brute facticity of your life, to start from scratch and to achieve a vision of your life that you could not have envisioned in your country of origin. That's part of the American dream. Is that dream a guarantee? No, because we don't live in a utopia. But America promises you an opportunity, and that's the best that it can do. I think that immigrants in this country who fall prey to a cult of victimology, who fall prey to a cult of helplessness, are very often right and correct in feeling that way. But I also feel that America is a country that has a self-reflexivity clause built into it. That is, America is a country that is always trying to correct its past. It has omitted and excluded from the domain of the ethical and the pantheon of the human community blacks, women, gays, for decades or centuries. And we are a country that tries to correct our mistakes. The 1964 Civil Rights Act, which I call the second founding of America, was one such pivotal moment. I think the Gettysburg Address was probably the I would call the 64 Act the third founding, the Gettysburg being the second founding, gives us a chance to refashion ourselves and to make something substantial or not so substantial of our lives, but that we cannot treat as axiomatic and as givens the brute facts of the atrocities and the nefarious aspects of American history. Because part of what it is to be an American, an immigrant in this country, is that America gives you the chance to suffuse the landscape with an original assemblage of who you are, and that you as an immigrant have the opportunity to write that script of what it is like to be an American. 55 years ago, 70 years ago, to be an American was synonymous with being white. Today, that situation is very, very different. America gives you the chance to suffuse it with an original assemblage of who you are and to write the script of what it is to be an America and to write the narrative and the mythology that forms what it is to be America. I think the American dream is slipping for many people because many people feel that they don't have the chance to modify their existence. They don't have the chance to transcend their brute facticity, their historicity, their history, their past. But that we should never give up, that as social warriors, whether you're a Republican or a Libertarian, a person who believes in justice, in the inalienability of rights for all persons, that we have an ethical responsibility to make sure that the conditions that make it possible for people to transcend their identities and modify their existence remain possible. So I wanted to end on this optimistic note and to say that unapologetically, this is an exceptional country. It is my reading of history, and I've spent many years reading world civilizations, an unprecedented phenomenon, the greatest country that has ever existed. And as an immigrant who has lived here for 33 years and have lived in the Deep South, has lived in the Deep South for 8 years in the 80s, where I went to school with people who had never seen a black person before and has experienced his fair share of discrimination and racism, that this still remains the best place where one can matriculate, not just economically, but morally. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Leah?
Okay, so first of all, thank you for having me here, Jane. Thank you, everyone, for coming out on this cold and late night. But also thank you to my fellow panelists for some really interesting thoughts that I'm hopeful that we'll get into, during the next portion of the program and during the Q&A. And I just thought, I actually shifted my remarks just a little bit in reaction to the other panelists on here tonight. And I just want to go through a couple of points quickly, starting off first with really thinking about some of the issues that I touch on in my book, The Loneliness of the Black Republican, Pragmatic Politics in the Pursuit of Power. So one of the things that I'm really interested in the book, and one of the things that I trace is not just African Americans' relationship to the Republican Party, or even racial minorities' relationship to the Republican Party between 1932 or so to 1981, but also African Americans more generally, Black people more generally, including a number of Black immigrants, and their political ideologies and their relationship to the Republican Party and to the Democratic Party and to the political process more generally. One of the things that is deeply important to these individuals throughout this period, and well into, as Christina pointed out, and well into the 21st century, is this idea of the American dream. And so how to become a part of the American dream, what are the necessary steps, what are the pragmatic decisions or the ideological decisions, but largely pragmatic decisions that I need to make in order to integrate myself into or assimilate into American culture, American society, or even just be a part of it and take advantages of the benefits of the American dream as we imagine it. The problem is that because of institutional inequalities, structural inequalities, history, right? History, particularly as it's layered on over the course of, through the 20th and into the 21st century, present day moments, many of these people, and some of the most interesting debates that arise, come out precisely because people see themselves denied access to the things that they believe they're entitled to through citizenship or through immigration to this country. And so I was really interested in exploring a lot of the ideas around this and the techniques that arise from this. So in the scope of my project and the research that I look on, we see a number of people who have this really abiding faith in this idea that if we can just desegregate the American dream, if we can just shift the American dream, then we too can partake in this. We can be part of, say, meritocracy. We can embrace kind of the liberal tradition of individualism. But because they're not access points, because they're not moments where we see people have ability to come in, we find that even the most conservative of, say, immigrants who come over, minority immigrants who come over, or African Americans, still find themselves on the outside of the political process and outside of kind of majority institutions and kind of outside of these institutions that were never meant for them to begin with. And so that's that kind of whole sordid history. And I really would encourage you to think about how and why it matters. The other point that I think is important to bring up, particularly on Martin Luther King Day, is to really think about how these leaders and these leaders around issues of civil rights, around issues of race, around even issues of immigration that we normally wouldn't connect to issues of civil rights, how they have been transformed through history, they and their legacy. And I would encourage us to really think through somebody like King and use him as a case study for really understanding and for thinking about these notions of equality and race and immigration in the 21st century. I mean, one of the most fascinating things about the legacy of Martin Luther King is how it gets shifted and reshaped and reworked until it's really something radically different from the man that we know existed. And the way that the public remembers King, for example, is really dependent upon individual agendas, on people's personal beliefs, on their memory, right? Their very selective memory of who King was. So we don't really have the complex radical that we know was interrogating ideas but evolving over time. So King in, say, 1954 is very different from King in 1968. Just think about, say, the I Have a Dream speech, which we all know. That's this kind of speech where King is actually frozen in time. This, standing in Washington, D.C., 1963. But instead, we don't really think about, say, chaos or community, where do we go from here? The Been to the Mountaintop speech. We don't think about King marching with sanitation workers for rights and wages in Memphis when he's shot and killed and assassinated. So I'm actually interested in thinking through and pulling out some of these ideas of King's, particularly around this idea of race, to think through some ideas of immigration and thinking about who King was when he died. When we look at actually writings from King and actions from King in 1968, he's describing himself as a militant, civilly disobedient protester engaged in direct action protest. And in fact, he's also talking about how it is his duty as an American patriot to actually align with these other organizations, including, indigenous American organizations, Black civil rights organizations. I mean, he meets with Stokely Carmichael in 1968, despite years earlier saying that Stokely Carmichael, who is a Trinidadian migrant, is not representative of, his America. So we're seeing him meeting with this. We're seeing him meeting with migrant worker groups, Mexican Americans, with white poor people from Appalachia. And we're seeing him talk through a number of these issues and call for ideas that we can, imagine that are all about interrogating kind of American institutions, American structures, but also the things that we imagine make up American democracy, and really calling into question the idea of American democracy and what the American dream might mean. So I think it actually would work here, if you don't mind, that I'd like to share, two quotes, very specific quotes from King towards the late 1960s. And I think King is being very explicit about what his ideas of, what it means to be an equal America. So he says, "We must honestly face the fact that the movement must address itself to the question of restructuring the whole of American society. There are 40 million poor people here, and one day we must ask the question, why are there 40 million poor people in America? And when you begin to ask that question, you are raising a question about the economic system, about a broader distribution of wealth. When you ask that question, you begin to question the capitalistic economy. And I'm simply saying that more and more we've got to begin to ask questions about the whole society." And the second quote, "When you deal with this, you begin to ask the question, who owns the oil? You begin to ask the question, who owns the iron ore? You begin to ask the question, why is it that people have to pay water bills in a world that's 2/3 water? These are the questions that must be said." He also asked, who are the people who are employing these people and exploiting their labor? They're either bringing them into the country or exploiting poor black workers or poor white workers across the country. So one of the things that I would encourage us to really think about is the way in which part of the American dream, or realizing the American dream, is the ways in which these various organizations, these various groups, critique American democracy and the American democratic project as it exists critically. And I think of that great Baldwin quote where he says, "I critique America precisely because I love America so much." That is the basis of patriotism. So I think I want to leave you guys with that before we open it up to a larger conversation, and really thinking about what it means kind of in this moment, to think about race in the 21st century, and thinking about what is our role and what is our responsibility in questioning these institutions in order to get to that envisioned American dream, or the vision of America that we hold in our imagination.
Thank you. What I hear to some degree emerging from the conversation is an exchange among the three of you about the relationship between an ideal of America, an America in idea, and the degree to which that idea does or does not conform to a certain kind of reality, or asking a question, what precisely is the relationship between the ideal and the reality? And certain moments what I'm hearing is people saying that while the ideal has been extraordinary and liberating in all kinds of ways, there are certain kinds of historical realities that get in the way of particular individuals exercising the capacities commended in the ideal, socioeconomic conditions, histories, and so forth. So I'm just wondering what any of you might say in response to that larger question. That is to say, what kind of historical conditions have to be in place in order for us to talk about functioning individuals who are out there in the world, stamping the world with their own identities, engaging in self-creation and so forth? Do there have to be some material conditions or institutional frameworks which make that possible? Or is it meaningful to say that any individual, no matter what their historical context, no matter what their history, has this capacity to transcend in the way the democratic ideal commends? I'm wondering what people think about that.
Well, I think this is where we would deviate. Because I actually think that this country has real limitations when it comes to people of color, but when it comes to black people explicitly. I don't think that the American dream is necessarily the house and the fence and the cars. I think it's the ability to have equity. And that's something that this nation has never righted that ship, right? Institutionally, she doesn't know how. And so when we think about something even as minor as, we were talking about this at dinner, something like the New Deal that's supposed to bring equity and some sort of equality to one's citizenship. FDR had to make concessions, and he sold out black people, black women in particular. And we've seen 80, 90 years later, the real economic repercussions of that decision, right? And this is why we tax income and not wealth, right? When we think about people who have been beneficiaries of the GI Bill, some people weren't even allowed in the wars, but if they were, they weren't beneficiaries of the GI Bill. This happened World War War II, Korea, Vietnam, and we're still seeing it. We're in the middle of 2 wars, if you all don't know, right? And so even when talking to young black vets, some of them didn't even know that the GI Bill was a possibility. So there's something going on in their recruitment process and also the articulation of their benefits. And because of that, we see people who have been redlined, we see people who have not been able to buy homes, we see people who don't have the protection of wealth, right? So we joke in New York, is anyone here from New York? Right, thank you. So, you know what real estate is in New York, right? And, when you see someone like slumming it and, working at a coffee shop and not really having care in the world, it's like, right, you're one dead grandmother away from being just fine, right? Because when your grandmother dies, she's going to leave you a fantastic house, and that's wealth. And no one has to pool money together to bury your grandmother. But there are other people who don't have wealth. They don't have 3 and 4 generations of real estate or whatever it may be, or some sort of government assistance that's enabled them to give future generations a totally different life. And so I think for black immigrants, some of the frustration that I found in my data is that why is it that I'm coming to America the same day as someone else from insert name of Asian or European country, and our life chances are totally different. And I think that's the struggle that we have with this prospect of the American dream.
You want to go ahead? No, you go ahead. Well, I want to say that the notion of equity and equality are different concepts. Would you agree? Mm-hmm. So how are you defining equity here?
So I would define equity as, if you want to talk about an economic space, then the ability to actually live up to one's potential and have the country provide what she promises everyone in the same space.
Right. All right. So I think short of a utopianistic society, the notions of equity are probably not going to happen, or short of a centrally planned socialist communist country, the notion of complete equity is somewhat incompatible with a free market system because of just the infrastructure and the apparatus that comes with that system is not amenable to something like equity for all human beings.
I mean, obviously not in a capitalist society. I mean, America is based on pure capitalism.
Right. So I think, to answer Ed's question, what would be necessary in terms of resources? I think we have to remember that America was founded not on economic equality, but on political equality. And that's a big misremembering that is running through this country's history. America was founded on political equality, and that is what Martin Luther King, initially at least, was fighting for. Full legal equality before the law. Economic equality is a very, very difficult dream or reality to achieve in a capitalist society because people come with different talents, different dispositions. And I'm not talking about the kind of crony capitalism we have here or the kind of affirmative action that has existed for white people from the inception of this country, from the subsidization of the railroad industry, subsidizing the gold rush, and the rise of the robber barons and so on. I'm simply talking about leaving people free to unleash their talents in the world. Leaving people free to exercise their capabilities requires political equality, full recognition before the law that all persons who are admitted in the pantheon of the human community are not discriminated against. So when we talk about issues of redlining, when we talk about issues of people kept out of domains that other people are allowed in, for no other reason than their skin color, there's something deeply nefarious and there's something deeply evil about that. And that is part of America's history and part of America's current reality that any honest person would have to acknowledge and seek to remedy. Given that, I do not think that the America that I see, well, let me not talk about the America that I see today. Because I'm giving a talk tomorrow on the moral majesty of America and her decline in the current political era. So I don't think that our notion of America should be determined by any administration that might be in power, however we feel about that administration, because America is much, much greater. So Ed, I think in response to your question, we need political equality. We need to make sure that we have a system of, as Christina said, equity in terms of however the country decides to distribute its resources, that the distribution of those resources are done, whether we're talking about public education, which is based on property taxes, the distribution of those resources are done in a non-discriminatory, non-arbitrary fashion. I think when some of those conditions are in place, we do see immigrants coming here who do not even speak the language, who are semi-literate, who are able to matriculate, who are able to attach themselves to certain resources that are available to them and to make something fundamental of their lives. I'm not an advocate of socialism. I'm an advocate of the free market system. I could, during a question and answer period, explain why I think a socialist system is not only untenable, but actually unethical, that the free market and the capitalist system provides the best milieu in which people can matriculate. Capitalism has liberated 350 million people, state capitalism in China. Capitalism has raised an unprecedented rate, raised a standard of living for people across the globe and in this country. There's an interesting book called How Capitalism Saved America. The life expectancy, the decrease in mortality rates, the increased standard of living, all attributed to capitalism. So you're asking me that question. I'm going to say something like more free enterprise, less regulations, less crony capitalism, which means that less partnership between governments and preferred groups of people where the preferential treatment is given based on skin pigmentation, which historically has been white. If we have a system of political freedom in this country where people are left alone, hands off, do not interfere with people's innate capacity to take care of themselves, do not infantilize them, they deserve no special treatment. All they deserve is an opportunity. Because America cannot, in any way, short of being a bloated totalitarian system, guarantee any systemic outcomes. All it can say is the opportunities that are here are made available to all persons. And we as individuals, ethical individuals, ought to make sure to commit ourselves to that, to making sure that the opportunities are available to all persons on an equal basis. But we cannot predict the outcomes. That's an entirely different story.
So I just want a couple of quick points on this. One, I think it would be helpful if we try and define this idea of the American dream, whether it would be in the American dream as envisioned, American dream as in practice. I also think that would help us, differentiate and locate these points of divergence and convergence around ideas, say, when we're talking about, say, socialism versus capitalism. But I think the bigger point, and again, a lot of these ideologies have made their way and coursed through these various communities, whether they be immigrant or whether they be born in the United States or rooted in the United States, have coursed through, and these have been questions that people have been discussing and debating over. But what I'm really interested in, or maybe what we should think about, is that even in the context where we acknowledge that, say, let's say that the way of the path, or the path that we want to follow, is the free market, that the idea of an actually free market is one that doesn't exist in our current iteration of, the American project. That, that there have been moments where, governments, where, regardless of political partisanship, have tried this idea of deregulating or desegregating these kind of various capitalistic approaches, only to see, these inherent, systematics rebuild themselves organically from within. And so I really wonder about what, say, a system would look like that would allow people to succeed vigorously, right, in the way that they imagine, or give them the opportunities to succeed, that doesn't, that takes into account like historical parity, or thinks, suggests that there's a proportional way in which these people can be represented, right? For example, Black people are disproportionately represented at the bottom, right? That we see disproportional representation in, say, Black women's maternal, mortality rates. That really some people are just asking, can we have equality across that? Can we have some kind of, so what would that look like? Well, historically, what we know that it's looked like, these moments of success, have come from government enforcement and regulation. And that, in fact, when we leave people to their own devices, particularly within the United States, even if we agree that it is the greatest place in the free world or what have you, that when left to their own devices, people actually don't do the right thing. So I actually think that part of the question that we're talking about is, how do we mix these things that we identify, again, as these American ideals, the American project, with institutions and with structures and with format that was never intended for the people that are now accessing it. And so once you come up with that, thinking about what are the ways in which to enforce these things, right? We can talk, I know we have a Reconstruction scholar in the room, but we can talk about, say, the way in which Reconstruction was successful so long as there was this stronghold moment. So we see these critical moments where it's important to have some kind of tension and some kind of relationship to the government. And that, again, when left to their own devices, these are things that people organically just don't do.
Right, because part of the myth is that this country's founded and predicated on political equity. This whole idea of citizenship that we still struggle with is because our founding of this nation excluded the vast majority of individuals who were living there. And so now that we are under certain laws and rules that are for everyone and to help everyone, and ostensibly to help everyone succeed, it's a real tension, because the bare bones of the nation was never set up to incorporate and absorb this amount of diversity. And when I say diversity, I mean in all aspects of the word. And I think that's the real struggle to see, is as our laws have evolved, how do we maintain these protections for all these different types of people across the nation when we still have this institutional structure and a power structure that grapples with essentially a white supremacist norm and a very diverse populace, and this new idea of 21st century citizenship.
Period.
I wonder if we could get to the capitalism stuff a bit. People often talk about capitalism as a process that involves creative destruction. All right, so new things appear as a consequence of innovation and win out in a certain kind of competitive dynamic. And there are losers in the dynamic. Mm-hmm. What, in any of your views of the American dream, to the degree that it's something other than a myth, what does the American dream say about what our society owes to the losers in the process? And is that a matter of justice from the point of view of the American dream, or is it a matter of charity from the point of view of the American dream, or is it a matter of decency to be concerned about the losers in the process of creative destruction? Or does the American dream not speak to this matter at all?
All right, since I brought up the moral defense of capitalism, let me say a couple of things about that. One is we have to look at the conditions under which people lose. So when people enter the Olympics or enter a sports competition, and the rules of the game are transparent, they're fair, and the rules of admission are open to those who qualify, we don't talk about how do we take care of the person who came last in a marathon race, or we don't talk about the person who came last in the swim meet. Because the rules or the conditions under which they lost were conditions that they entered into freely, that the nature of the game was one that fair-minded and reasonable people would say, everyone who started that race had a good opportunity. So when we look at the history of America and we look at capitalism, we realize that the analogy that I just painted doesn't really hold up. So you and I would probably agree here that there has been affirmative action for white people since the inception of this country. There has been a nefarious form of identity politics that has been going on. When people talk about, and I'm not a fan of identity politics, but when people talk about identity politics, they forget the flip side of identity politics, the identity politics that reinforce white supremacy in the inception of this country's birth. So, Ed, I think that when we talk about losers, we have to talk about people who have been unjustly treated or whose rights have been violated, people for whom admission was probably never an option. But let's assume here that we live in an era in which there are anti-discriminatory laws on the books, both in education, in the workplace. They're not perfect, but people choose to enter into the free market competition and they lose. You lose at your own risk. I'm sorry, capitalism cannot say, compete, and then if you lose, here are a list of conditions under which we're going to take care of you. I want to say that welfare is one way in which we can take care of the losers, but welfare should be like an ambulance service and not a transportation system. So built into the structure of capitalism, I don't see anything that is inimical or anathema to capitalism that would disqualify denizens of those worlds from taking care of losers in a strategic, timely fashion. But if we're talking here about taking care of losers by creating something like a welfare state that takes care of you from birth, from cradle to death, or a welfare state that takes care of the losers that enter the fray of the capitalist competition, I think there's something fundamentally wrong about that. And I don't think it's possible if that welfare system is going to be a permanent fixture of American society. As I said, it should be like an ambulance service, not a transportation system. A system that says, we help you to get back on your feet, we give you benefits, there are resources, there are infrastructures, whether that's job training skills provided through partnership with government and the state, whatever those are. But I think the way the question is posed is good and can also lead to erroneous conclusions. That is, do we have a moral responsibility for people who, under the right conditions, assuming that such conditions are right, under the right conditions, enter into a competition and lose? And I would say, in terms of government responsibility, assuming those conditions were fair, the answer is no. Now, as citizens of the world, as citizens of as compatriots, we do have a responsibility if we choose to incur that responsibility through voluntarism, through charity, and through pursuing policies that will remedy the injustices of these institutions that make the conditions for competition unfair in the first place, right?
You first.
I mean, I just feel like America's always moved her goalposts.
Always what?
Moved her goalposts. So this idea that, all systems are equal, I don't see it. I think that we place different values on different types of work and always have, depending on who's doing it, when they're doing it, sometimes where they're doing it. When we think about, obviously the welfare system in this country is flawed, but we also have to like zoom out 30,000 feet. And it's like, well, why are people in dilapidated housing? Why has there been disinvestment of their neighborhoods? Why are their school systems subpar? Why are all these things? I mean, we can go down the list. Why is their air terrible? Why are there no hospitals there? Why are they using hospitals just as emergency rooms? I mean, all of these things are part of an institutional structure of disinvestment in so many communities that end up being this larger welfare conversation. And I'm always reminded of France, where, you asked, what's our responsibility, what's our obligation? And, as the noblesse found out in France, it's like, you take all the food away from the poor, they have nothing left to eat but the rich. And we're not there yet, but I think that we could be there. Still, I mean, people are going on to, paycheck number 2 with the government shutdown. And so we haven't taken to the streets the way the French have. But I agree with you fundamentally that, whatever system we have right now is highly flawed, but I do think that it's part of a much larger institutional structure of disinvestment of communities over time, such that there's no place to turn except for the government, even though in many ways the United States has had a very active hand in their circumstance.
Yeah, so I think when you're talking about the losers, you're you're talking about poverty. Right? You're talking about poor people. For a long time, we were talking about poor people. We're also now talking about working class people who are living, and middle class people who are living paycheck to paycheck. I think again, in a system where all things are equal, all regulations, all boundaries, all conditions put forward are equal. In a capitalist system, then the losers are the losers. But we're not actually talking about a system that simply is based on you put in hard work, et cetera, and you're good to go. So if you work really hard, you too can be at the top of the food chain. But instead, we also have to take into account things like where were you born, what town were you born, what zip code, what hospital, right? What gender, what race, what sexual orientation, right? So now that we can actually extrapolate that from both quantitative and qualitative ways and say that those things do have an effect on your life chances, your life outcomes, and your success in this society, And in some respects, right, United States, even as again, a first world nation, one of the wealthiest in the world, looks like a third world country across some of these numerical values. So part of what I'm wondering, and part of what the conversation that the United States has steadily had, particularly in moments of crisis, right? Thinking about, say, the Great Depression, thinking about the Great Recession of more recent, thinking about these times of very dark financial crisis. Thinking the United States has been forced to think about, okay, what does America owe to its citizens when we see the breakdown of our capitalist way of life, right? When things are not, when it looks like everybody is losing. So one of the things that, consistently the United States has come back and said, we owe some kind of welfare state for our citizens. We have to. Right? This is the initial function of the New Deal. We can't, we go into crisis mode. We can't allow our nation to suffer in this way. But I think as we come out, we forget those moments. It's very convenient to forget those moments. What's interesting now is that we're in a moment where the people at the bottom, right, not only look the same as they always have, right? the brown of America, the brown and black of America, but are also starting to look, whiter in some respects. And so now we're starting to hear really loud questions about what does the state owe its citizens, and what are the kind of programs that should be put in place to protect the rights of the people who have found, who have done what they thought they were supposed to do into the system, done everything, and find that the output is not what they expected, right? And are saying, actually, that's not the right thing, right? We see this in moments like Occupy Wall Street, but we also see it in glimmers of anger around things like the Tea Party movement, or even in points, in the lead up to the 2016 election and the actual election, across the board. So I think we actually do have to have a conversation about what is the role of the state, particularly around issues of, a system that is flawed.
But Leah, I defer to you as the historian, but I would say this country's always had poor white people.
Absolutely. Now we have more.
Yeah, but I think that the trick has always been leadership explaining to white people that they weren't as poor as they were. And if they are poor, it's because of these black folks, or now because of Mexicans, right? And so as LBJ said, he's like, you can convince the poorest white man that he's better than a Negro, and you can pick his pockets all day long. And so I think we're at this moment where, King wasn't assassinated, trying to liberate black folks. He was assassinated trying to coalesce poor white people with everybody else. And I think that's always been the hat trick of this nation, to make poor white people believe that, like, the country's working for them. And when the few times it's not, it's because of people who look like us. But it's like, but this country wasn't ever set up for poor white people either. And this is the real tension, I think, that is coming to the fore, where we have someone who's excavating it. But, a recession for some is a depression for others. And so bring it back to, where you started with King, I think it's really important for us to remember, like, that was the latter King, the more radical King, is the King that's talking to the people in Appalachia, saying, I don't really think that our circumstances I don't really see them deviating that much. There are some particular instances because of skin color, but everything else economically, keep in mind, the 1963 March on Washington was a march on Washington for jobs and freedom. And that wasn't just for black people, that was for American citizens.
Well, I think now might be a good time to open up the conversation to Q&A. And so if you have a question that you would like to put to the panel, we're prepared to entertain that now. We'd ask simply that you address your question to a particular member of the panel, and that you speak in a microphone that will be made available to you. So, are there questions? Comments? There are a couple here. One at the back there. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Sivusa and I'm a sophomore. My question, I think, could be answered by all the panelists, but more specifically for the gentleman in the middle. I'm so sorry, I'm terrible
Jason
with
Hill.
names. But effectively, referring to an earlier comment that you made about differentiating between political and economic equity, how do you make that distinction in light of not only like the historical pretext of this country being like founded by wealthy landowners who were basically exporting to Europe, right? Like, and that's the economic basis of it, but also events as recently as 2008 where you're bailing out huge banks and then the poor people who have lost their money don't have access to that. So how do you like create that separation ideologically between political and economic equity?
Well, look, I think we just have to stop getting away from this question of who this country was founded for. We know who the founders were. And this question of, this country was not founded for this group of people is kind of old hat. In the interest of not fetishizing history or reifying history, or in the interest of not acting as if those are unalterable circumstances, that is the founding of America, and for whom America was founded, can't be altered. We need to move beyond that, right? So built in, as I said when I opened up in my opening remarks, built into the American system that was racist, sexist, and patriarchal were self-correcting mechanisms, but there's a self-reflexivity clause at the heart of the American system that consistently seeks to redress problems and to bring into the pantheon of the human community those who had been excluded. And this is just, anybody who says the opposite, I would say is just putatively lying. This is just empirically wrong. The 1964 Civil Rights Act fundamentally changed that. It granted legal equality to blacks. Now, when there are egregious violations, when the state egregiously will violate your individual rights as a citizen, that's something that has to be taken up. But I would venture to say that official oppression of black people ended, political oppression of black people in this country ended with the 1964 Civil Rights Act. That there are still systemic forms of racism, virulent forms of racism going on, but if you talk about political equality, we don't live under a system anymore where the state can legally disqualify you on any number of registers based on your skin color. I mean, I hope that answers your question, but maybe it doesn't. It's the best I have to offer right now.
There was another question there.
And there's one over there.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Thank you.
Hi, this is for Professor Hill also. In terms of the political equity, when you look at our incarceration rates for black men and for white men with relatively similar crime rates, and that leads to a larger disenfranchisement of those people, how do you think that plays into political equity when there's a huge group of people that aren't able to have a direct political voice in our system?
It's a complete violation of political equality, and anyone who's concerned with justice should be outraged at what some people call the prison industry complex. When you systematically create crimes by criminalizing certain behaviors that you affix to certain racial groups, and when those same so-called crimes are committed by members of another racial group who get 0 prison sentences or a mitigated form, and that is exactly what I'm talking about. That is a violation of political equality, and that is a problem that no matter what political party you belong to, I'm a conservative Democrat, or you're a Republican or you're a Libertarian, as someone who's a seeker of justice, you ought to make it an ethical mandate of yours to correct. So I'm in complete agreement with you on that issue.
Hi. My question is also directed at Professor Hill. My antenna was tweaked when I heard that you had a cosmopolitan view, sort of, and particularly my question is, you started out your talk with sort of putting the U.S. sort of on a plateau, sort of at the peak of things in terms of like historically seeing that when you look in history in other states, the U.S. is the best example that you can see. And I wonder, how much do you take into consideration the U.S. as well as the role of other Western nations in ensuring that that is what we have today? So is it possible that we could have had better examples of equitable leaving, of equality, of the American dream, if I would put it that way, if not for the influence or the direct obstruction of those existence in other countries, and particularly, especially when you reject the utopia. You reject the utopia, but over and over again in your speech, I hear you talk about you step away from the materialist expressions of the ideals, the capitalist ideals that you talk about. So isn't there sort of like a contradiction between not wanting to talk about utopias, but then refusing and failing to realize that the materialization of those ideals speak very differently to the way they exist as theory.
All right, so your question is a long one, and I'm a stickler for the language, and it consists in many compound sentences that I can't retain in my brain, but I'm going to try to address. No, it's not a criticism, it's actually a compliment. I'm going to try to address the first part of your question. There are two things. One is, you said, how do I feel about other countries being exemplars of the ideal civilization had it not been for the obstructionist efforts of America? I do not believe in monocausal reductionistic explanations. I do not think that one can ostensibly point to America and say America is single-handedly responsible for the fact that other civilizations haven't achieved the superlative achievements of this civilization. A lot of countries have intractable problems dealing with democracy, don't have the infrastructures that promote democratic institutions, liberal democratic institutions. So yes, America, I'm writing a book on American foreign policy for the past 70 years. It looks at the hypocritical and unethical nature of American foreign policy and the obstructionist role that America has played in undermining the progressive impulses of other countries. But I don't believe in monocausal explanations. It's more complicated than that. But I want to get back to the first thing that you said. America is the first country that, in my mind, created a political milieu that is consonant with with human rational nature, that is creating the conditions under which our capabilities and our talents can flourish. That is freedom. America gave birth to a constitutional republic, which to me is the most advanced and superior form of political expression. I don't know what would have happened if Native Americans had been left. I don't know what happened if other civilizations had been left. Maybe they would have, I said this at dinner, maybe they would have lived some sort of pastoral, bucolic life, and we would not have had the creation of aqueducts and sewer systems and skyscrapers and medicine and science and the birth of modern technology. I don't know. What I do know is that this country was forged in unique circumstances. We created a political system that is unparalleled, unprecedented. There's a reason why we are mistakenly trying to put up a wall. There's a reason why people are not trying to get into North Korea or Saudi Arabia or Iran. They're trying to come into America. Cuba, the Soviet Union used to put up walls to keep people from leaving. We're now putting up a wall to prevent people from coming. People come into this country for a reason, because it is an exceptional country that has created a political environment in which the best within ourselves can flourish.
Can I just...
That's what I was going to ask, because I feel like the other two doctors are up here as window dressing so that Dr. Hill can talk. So I would love to hear responses from each of you.
Yeah, I want to go back to your question, because I think it's really important. You know, when we think about, say, the caravan and this whole idea of everyone wants to be in America, we very rarely ask ourselves why people are fleeing other nations. I might say it's because of things, no, it's not one cause, but I might say it's because of things that Americans have done, right? We love war. This country loves war. We've been at war every single year of our inception, except for like 17 years. So are we asking ourselves how we've propped up dictators in Guatemala or Honduras or Panama or whatever it may be over time, Chile, Ecuador, Peru. I mean, the list can go on, right? And so because of our economic interests, our greed, our desire to be number one, whatever it is, however you want to window dress it, I think very rarely do we ask ourselves that question. We had an opportunity to ask ourselves that question in 2001, and we didn't. And the frustration I feel is that we have done a lot of things to a lot of people across the globe for a very long time. And our beautiful Constitution, as someone who teaches and studies American politics, we're at a crisis point where we shall see if the greatness of America can withstand the moment that we're in. We have been running around the nation telling everyone else how they should behave, but we're the babies. We're telling older nations, nations that have much more complex problems than ours, how they should behave, and we're now at our crisis moment where we're going to look around and see who comes to save us. Right now, many countries are learning how to get by without us. So I don't know. I think your question is multifaceted and has a real deep respect for history that moves beyond America as this beacon on the hill, which again goes back to this larger question of what is the myth of America versus what has been the consistent reality of America.
I'll just say very quickly, I think we have to think a lot about this question of America as a land that's forged in ideals and ideas of freedom, particularly when the labor and America itself was built on enslaved labor.
Free labor.
Free labor. So I think it's a question that has haunted the United States. It's one that people have tried to deal with not so great results. And I think it's one that hasn't been resolved, but runs itself through, just go visit any museum in Washington, D.C., right? This idea of freedom and what does freedom actually mean in a land that's founded on unfree labor. And then I don't have anything to add to what you said about about America's role in the larger global environment, except to say that America is intertwined, right? Like this is American foreign policy, that it is part of this larger project and has ripple effects and consequences, the likes of which we're seeing come back. I mean, wasn't it Malcolm X who said the chickens have come home to roost?
Always.
So, I mean, we're in a global, right? A global moment. We are a global power. And so we're dealing with that history, but we're also continue to deal with our role as a global power moving forward, and what is that investment and what does it actually mean?
And there's a hand
question?
down front too.
A question for Doctors Greer and Rigueur. Specifically, I wanted to ask, both of you had comments, and I know you haven't done work on this as far as I know, but about the legacy of Dr. King and the way in which it has been co-opted. I forget what she said today, but my favorite parody Twitter account, which is the actual account of Sarah Sanders today, had a great tweet respecting Dr. King and kind of undertaking this mantle in a very, I would say, milquetoast way. So could either of you talk about the process by which that happened? How we got from Arizona not wanting to have Dr. King's birthday as a holiday in 19...
You mean John McCain?
Yeah, John McCain, right, that guy. And going from that to this embrace and the way in which the embrace has actually had the impact of dulling the message that Dr. King stood for us, particularly in the last 3 years of his life.
I mean, I'll let Leah take the bulk of this as the historian, but I mean, look at the way this country has always dealt with race. We had this thing called slavery that's like taught like that, and then we just fast forward to Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King. Sometimes if you went to a progressive school, you learned about Frederick Douglass, right? Very rarely about Reconstruction, very rarely about Jim Crow, very rarely about the thousands of other civil rights leaders who made this happen. And so we've, as Leah said earlier, we've frozen Dr. King into the moment in time that it's most palatable. We don't read about Radical King. We don't read, his Vietnam speech from Riverside Church in Harlem. We don't read about, letter from a Birmingham jail, right? We don't really read much of his 1967 or 68 writings at all, or hear much about them. And so there's a great article today about Stevie Wonder, traveling around the country to make Dr. King's birthday a holiday in 1980, which was obviously lots of people resisted that because some people still remembered who he was when he died. Well, when he was assassinated. And like that's also part of the problem. People keep saying when he died. He didn't die of cancer or natural causes. He was assassinated for a reason. He's assassinated in Memphis organizing sanitation workers. He's assassinated because he's trying to build not just a domestic movement, but also a global movement as well. And so we don't just assassinate people who we care less about. And so there's something about the remaking of history that this country is very comfortable with. Myth-making, essentially. And I credit a large part of his legacy, obviously, to Coretta Scott King, to making sure that we don't forget him, full stop. Same with like Winnie Mandela, when Nelson Mandela was incarcerated for so long. I really wonder, this is just a side comment, I really wonder what King would be like if he weren't assassinated. Because we have seen leaders get co-opted for a host of reasons, not just black, but leaders full stop. So I'd be curious to see, a King at 90, what he would, not just what he would think about America today, but what he would actually speak out about. Just sort of thinking about some of the former Black Panther leaders and the roads that they chose to take.
So, short answer, validation and a legitimizing project. So the idea of a King holiday, for example, a King federal holiday is introduced into Congress every year from the moment that King is assassinated. And it's incredibly important. It initially starts out as this kind of small band of supporters who are like, no, we should have this thing. And increasingly over the years, first, we see this kind of pushback. By the mid-1980s, 19 states have their own version of the King holiday. And they're doing, some are celebrating on his actual birthday, some are celebrating it for whatever reason, like the third Monday of January. But they're doing it on their own. And we start to see all of this kind of conversation around maybe this is a moment where the King holiday's time has come. And maybe, this is I say this as a connecting project because the King holiday is intimately intertwined with this idea of his shifting perception about who he was, right? So his legacy. So if 19 states, right, including South Carolina and North Carolina by 1984 are suggesting that we have a King holiday, that means that something has changed in the culture. Something has happened because when he dies, as he's organizing people are screaming, no, you're the real racist. No, your project is, there's this one meeting where a woman screams out, I hope somebody kills you, right before he's actually killed. So that there's something happening there in terms of a legitimizing project, and we see bits and pieces of it that come out of the King Commission because the criticism that emerges is, well, he was a radical, he was immoral, and we still see this in the mid-1980s. In fact, it was just going through earlier today, the Michigan Conservative Unions starts a letter-writing campaign in 1983. 14,000 members are saying, this guy is bad, he's evil, he's a communist, he's a radical, why are we having national collective amnesia? And it comes to the Reagan administration, which is, Reagan says King is a communist. And the pushback is from people within the administration, but also people from who are on the committee, is that this isn't how we should remember King. We should remember King for what he did for all people: justice, peace, and freedom. And this becomes a way to make it palpable, right, to the broader American public, which is to tone King down. And then what happens, it becomes a way of using King to legitimize whatever it is that, whatever agenda, whatever motion, whatever initiative that you have. And you see that it quickly takes off, right? In the aftermath of, say, the King holiday, people who had opposed the holiday are out here saying, happy MLK Day, right? Peace be with you. And, using it for whatever is necessary in the moment, but also to shield themselves from charges, right, of racism, of discrimination, of, and sorry if there are any Steve King fans in here, but definitely tweeted today about honoring Martin Luther King, right? 2 weeks after he asked questions about white supremacy and white nationalism. So it becomes this way, right, of legitimizing, validating, but also providing cover for a lot of initiatives.
There's a legal scholar from the University of Denver, I believe. I'm blanking on her name right now. She's got a book coming out, but she basically has found that 87% of the time, right-wing federal judges will cite King before they essentially throw the book at a black defendant, and that's a way of providing sort of racial cover. And so they were saying that sort of more left-leaning judges don't cite King at all, and sort of have particular rulings. And so we're seeing particular justices from a particular right-wing ideological bent leaning on King to justify their rulings against blacks.
There's a question here. Right here. Is there...
Hi, I just kind of, I'm sorry. Okay, building on this discussion of both Martin Luther King Jr.'s activism in the economic kind of circumstance of America, as well as the idea that many social justice issues are tied to economic circumstance, how would you, this is a question for the whole panel, but I'm curious to understand how you would see globalization affecting America's modern circumstance and the economic disparity that's prevalent today.
I mean, well, why would you pose the question as the way you... I think there's something not flawed, but I think there's something problematic about the way you pose your question. That is, America has some sort of sole responsibility for the destabilization of the world through globalization. I would like you to actually clarify the question a little bit more, because I would reject the way that you pose the question and say that America has no sole responsibility for the destabilization of the world owing to globalization. Globalization is a phenomenon that America is a part of. China is a part of it. Russia is a part of it. A whole plethora of nations are part of this globalization process. So why would you single out America as bearing sole responsibility for the destabilization of the world? Again, blaming America in this age of Americophobia for everything that goes wrong with America, finger pointing to America. America is to blame.
I'm sorry, I actually was more wondering how you thought globalization was affecting America's circumstance, not so much.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay, that's not the way you pose the question. Okay.
Well, okay, yeah. So I apologize for misinterpretation or perhaps lack of communication on my part.
All right. Well, since I challenge your question, I will defer to my panelists to respond as they see fit.
That's not fair. Now you have to follow up. Now you got to answer that. You got to answer it.
I got to answer it?
Yeah.
All right. Well, in fundamental terms, I don't see globalization destabilizing America in any way. Quite the opposite. At dinner, I was talking about the more emphatic role that I think America ought to be playing in leading the world on a moral path. That I think America has retracted. We're retreating back to some sort of pre-World War II isolationism in terms of the moral role. Untenable, problematic as it was, we did play a moral role in world affairs. And so I don't know if it's because of the advancement of globalization that's responsible for this. I doubt it quite seriously. I think it's a much more nefarious explanation that there are people who, and I voted twice for Obama, that's a disclaimer, I don't need to say this, but I think when Obama started making apologies for Americans, started talking about soft power and apologizing for American exceptionalism, I think this was the beginning of, for me, as a conservative Democrat, something quite unfortunate, because it began a precipitous decline in America's role in moral leadership. And I know that there are many of you in the audience who think that America has no business posturing moral leadership, but it has, it should, and if it doesn't, it's going to create a vacuum, and that vacuum is going to be filled by, I won't call the names of those countries because wouldn't want to offend students who might be from some of those countries here today. But we know those countries. It will create a vacuum, and that vacuum is going to be filled by nefarious, really, truly evil states who would seek to undermine worldwide democracy in a way that would make America's role in undermining democracy seem like kindergarten's play.
I mean, this isn't really my wheelhouse, but I'll say this. I think Americans are addicted to goods and cheap goods. We're also saddled with debt, as has been exposed by the government shutdown, because it's not just the 800,000 government workers, right? It's the waiters and the waitresses at the restaurants that they frequent. It's the dog walkers. It's the babysitters. It's the scientists who can't get into their labs. It's a lot of people. It's the lawyers, right, who are living in nice apartments, but also check to check. So I think globalization is hitting America because we have an influx of goods, and we want more goods, and we want cheaper goods constantly. But our own economic prospects continue to sort of decline. This idea of, many of your parents or grandparents may have worked at a job for decades, and those types of jobs are getting fewer and fewer. Shout out to academia if you can get tenure, right? I mean, this is one of the few jobs that's sort of left is like a company job, right? Factory jobs don't really exist the way they used to. When you think about, say, your grandmother, my grandmother, being able to buy a house without a college degree or a high school degree even. That's harder and harder every single year for economic advancement for people who aren't sort of in this system. But to be in the system, you also are riddled with debt. So that's my worry. We haven't sort of countered, we have people driving around Hummers. It's like, why do we need a war vehicle on a random road? Maybe you guys do in Minnesota because of your snow, but for the most part, the things that we're interested in just have very little basis to reality sometimes.
Well, I think we are at the end of our time. Please join me in expressing gratitude for our stimulating conversation. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Good night.
Thank you. You have to come to the Tenement Museum. I'm serious. When you come to New York, let me see if I'm a good board member. I am a good board member.